I will go ahead and introduce her presentation title for today, which is I'm going to Vashti Queen right out of my hair, the evolution of the Purim Spiel as musical theater parody. And please join me in welcoming Debra.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and great to see everybody today. I'm here representing the lowbrow on this panel. So just prepare yourself for a little lowbrow entertainment. So let's set the scene. It's Purim somewhere in America. Lights up on a synagogue bima, temporarily converted into a theatrical stage. The pulpit stashed off to the side or covered with some hastily improvised draping, the ordinarily staid lighting adjusted for maximum dramatic effect, a bucket of props and costume pieces assembled from various congregants' closets, basements, and attics, stashed on the maybe non-existent sidelines. Amateur actors wait in the non-existent wings, holding scripts that have been freshly written over the past few weeks. At the sound of the first piano chord, the audience quiets. They know exactly what they're about to hear. A story that everyone in the room knows by heart, retold in a way that is both completely original and utterly familiar. The audience is about to see a form of Jewish theatrical parody that draws upon hundreds or even thousand-year-old traditions of social commentary and political satire passed down for generations, dating back at least to medieval Europe. Most members of the audience are not aware of this. The audience is also about to see a wholly original one-act musical, thoroughly steeped in the musical, structural, and narrative conventions that have dominated Broadway since Rodgers and Hammerstein invented the book musical, more on that later, and launched the golden age of Broadway in 1943. Most members of the audience are not aware of this either. What they do know is that what they are doing is tradition, every bit as much as hearing the Megillah or eating hamantaschen or dressing up in costume, and perhaps most importantly, that it is fun. So how exactly did one-act works of musical theater that parody Broadway material or popular American culture become a synagogue staple? Indeed, we could even say there's something maybe especially unlikely about this marriage of Jewish traditional holiday observance with the Broadway musical. The Broadway musical is a genre that was largely created by first and second generation American Jewish immigrants or children of immigrants who were deeply invested in masking and hiding their Jewish identity. People like Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, the Gershwin brothers, Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, Lawrence Hart, Jerome Robbins, and many, many, many others. Indeed, it was actually the rare Broadway songwriter of the Golden Age period who was not Jewish. Famous example is Cole Porter. When Cole Porter, who was a Yale-educated Episcopalian from Indiana, when he first met Richard Rodgers in 1926, 24-year-old Richard Rodgers was the toast of the town, while 35-year-old Porter's shows had all flopped. They had a conversation about it, and according to Richard Rodgers, Cole Porter said, "Don't worry, I think I figured it out. I think I now understand the secret to writing a hit Broadway show. I'll write Jewish tunes." And indeed, in the late 1920s, 1930s, and beyond, Cole Porter very famously borrowed Jewish musical ideas that he had learned from his Jewish Broadway composer peers for hit songs like Begin the Begin or Night and Day, I Love Paris, many, many, many others. He very consciously took on these Jewish musical modalities to fit in with his peers. So many scholars, including Andrea Most, Stuart Hecht, Elisa Solomon, many others, have written at length about the complex relationship between Broadway's most legendary musical theater creators and their Jewish identity. The creators of the Golden Age Broadway book musical were largely Jews who would have scarcely imagined themselves, let alone their work, showing up in a synagogue. They were Jews who changed their names when they entered the entertainment industry, from Gershowitz to Gershwin, from Rabinovich to Robbins. For the most part, they carefully and studiously avoided overtly Jewish subjects or characters, with the great exception of Fiddler on the Roof, where Jerome Robbins famously agonized and famously raged as he wrestled with his own complex feelings about his Jewish identity. Side note, since we were talking about Fiddler this morning, Rodgers and Hammerstein considered writing a version of the Tevye story as a musical, and they passed on it because it was too Jewish. But they optioned Tevye's Daughters, and then they rejected the idea. Anyway, so 80-odd years after Oklahoma introduced American audiences to the Broadway book musical, what we know now as the Broadway musical, you can walk into almost any synagogue in America, at least in the non-Orthodox world, one night a year, and encounter a fusion of popular American theater, Jewish cultural memory, and religious observance. Here we go with some examples. Whether you're going to see Oppie Chorus Line, or Hamilton, The Greatest Haman, or Les Mizrahi, a classic like Oklahoma, sorry I don't have a poster for that one, or a cultural mashup on a level that the Jewish composers and lyricists of Golden Age Broadway could have truly never, ever imagined, like Mordechai Superstar. More often than not, contemporary Jews attending Purim services are likely to have a mini Broadway musical experience in parody form alongside their holiday observance. The contemporary Purim spiel is more often than not a Jewish cultural product that is in direct dialogue with the Broadway musical, and somewhat continuous dialogue, as we'll see from some of the more contemporary examples. You might ask, okay, so what do you mean by a Broadway Purim spiel? Does it have to draw directly from the musical theater canon? Are we talking only about like Rodgers and Hammerstein here? What about Frozen Chosen or The Shushan Mermaid? This is from my synagogue. That's my daughter in the front singing on the left side. She's Vashti. Or The Shushan Mermaid or Esther and the Beast. So Disney is a whole category unto itself. Disney isn't exactly Broadway, except maybe when it is. But the Disney and Disney-style animated movies of the past several decades are directly based on Broadway musicals and thoroughly steeped in their song architecture conventions. After all, it was Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, the celebrated musical theater writing team behind Little Shop of Horrors, who brought Broadway musical conventions to Disney with The Little Mermaid, launching a new era of animated musical film. So Disney counts. By the way, if you can think of a Broadway show, chances are someone has made a Purim spiel based on it. So as for Little Shop of Horrors, which you might think of as maybe an unlikely candidate for a great Purim spiel, never fear, there are several different versions. There's Little Shop of Horrors. There's Little Spiel of Horrors. There's Little Spiel of Horrors, Little Shushan of Horrors and Schnorrers, and perhaps my personal favorite, which I sadly have no poster for. Not everybody makes posters for these amateur theater things. My personal favorite, Little Schnapps for Schnorrers, which hews perhaps the closest to the original. Haman is actually a man-eating plant from outer space, and he develops a hunger for the Jewish people after eating a Jewish dentist. I know, right? These get very creative. What about popular musical mashups that don't draw from Broadway composers, but draw from American popular music or global popular music? A Beatles medley Purim spiel called Across the Juniverse, for example, or an Elton John theme spiel, or Esther's Story, Taylor's version, many versions of which were somewhat popular this past year in the sort of Taylor Swift era. I would argue that these popular music parodies, at least the ones that I have seen, they tend to function like contemporary jukebox musicals. So a jukebox musical is a work of musical theater that takes pre-existing popular music songs and sort of shoehorns them in to the architecture of a musical theater story. They work in very much the same way as any other work of musical theater. They're just using pre-existing material. These Purim spiels work the same way. They're jukebox Purim Broadway musicals. So I count them too. My argument here really is that we can understand contemporary Purimspielen best as original works of musical theater parody that are in dialogue with Broadway. Now, like all forms of amateur theater, these are works that have been almost entirely overlooked by scholars. In her landmark 2019 book, Beyond Broadway, The Pleasure and Promise of Musical Theater Across America, theater scholar Stacey Wolf documents how amateur productions are actually the way that most Americans encounter theater most often. Most Americans don't habitually go to professional theater, but most Americans see a camp show or a school show, or if you're Jewish, a Purimspiel. So, if you think about all of the theater you've seen across your lifetime, what percentage of that theater has been amateur productions? Stacey Wolf's argument is that this is the sort of core of what's happening in American theater. Much of what we can really study and understand about it is what's happening in these amateur productions rather than what's happening on Broadway, because it's reaching the most people, and it's kind of the broadest form of theatrical discussion happening in the culture. There's something maybe similar to be said about Purimspielen. So there was a time when most American Jews regularly attended professional Jewish theaters. There was a time when many Jews around the world regularly attended professional Jewish theaters. Today, those theaters are few and far between, making today's musical theater parody Purimspielen, as silly as they are, the most widespread and influential form of American Jewish theater today. So for that reason alone, I think they deserve a closer look. Okay, so let's take a step back for a second. For hundreds of years, amateur theatrical comedy has been an integral part of how Ashkenazic Jews read, interpret, and teach the Megillah and celebrate Purim. Medieval Yiddish Purimspielen, which many people in the room know about, were typically semi-improvised comedic retellings, often in rhyming prose couplets, of a wide range of Jewish stories, not just the story of Esther, but also other biblical stories with dramatic potential, like the binding of Isaac, the selling of Joseph, stories that could be retold in deeply dramatic ways. Traditional Purimspielen took place outside of the synagogue. They took place outside of liturgical practice. They were sort of bawdy folk performances that happened in private homes or sometimes yeshivas, sometimes just outdoors in the street. The placement of Purimspielen in the synagogue is a pretty modern invention, so I think that's important to keep in mind as well. Purimspielen in all of their various forms throughout history have always operated in parody and satire, which have long been hallmarks of various types of Purim holiday traditions. But historically, the thrust of this parody was typically to poke fun at internal Jewish religious texts, liturgy, and communal norms. The Purim rabbi, for example. Another popular medieval European Purim tradition alongside Purimspielen was Purim parodies of Talmudic tractates. So here, for example, this is a famous Purim Talmud from 1892 by Gershon Rosenzweig, the Yankee Talmud, which made fun of what it was to be a Jew in America, the false promises of the Golden Land. There's a whole section in this Talmud about the low standards of Jewish education in America. But the thrust of contemporary musical theater, Purimspielen runs in the opposite direction. So instead of creating parodies of Jewish text and culture, they parody popular American culture with a Jewish twist. And this is, I think, somewhat equally true whether we're talking about a musical theater Purimspiel right here in Los Angeles or like Les Mizrahi, way back here, one in Australia, right? Because musical theater is a quintessentially American art form. It is America's greatest theatrical export, and it is the art form that people most closely associate with the American theater. So whether you have a musical theater parody Purimspiel that's happening here or elsewhere, it's in dialogue with this very quintessentially, particularly American art form. So musical theater is a hybrid form of storytelling where the narrative arc of the story is furthered through dialogue, song, and sometimes dance, the important part being in more or less equal measure. That's what differentiates musical theater from something like operetta or sort of pre-existing, pre-1943 forms of theater that combined song and storytelling. The story is equally furthered through the dialogue and the songs, and if there is dance, also through dance. They're all contributors to the narrative storytelling rather than let's step over here and have a song for a second. A little bit later today, we'll hear a little bit about raisins and almonds from the Yiddish operetta Shulamis. This is a great example of music as maybe not narrative storytelling. You have a whole story happening, then you have a character who says, you know, that reminds me, I think I'm hungry. I wonder what I have in my backpack. Oh, I have raisins and almonds. That reminds me of a song. Sings a song completely unrelated to the story, then we're back to the story. Musical theater doesn't do that. The songs have to further the narrative. So in musicals, characters keep interrupting themselves in bursts of story-propelling song that operate in rather specific ways. A character might speak one line and sing the next, or the whole world might freeze while a song allows the audience to hear a decision-making process that's happening inside a character's head. Or a song might propel us dramatically forward in time while defining a character's emotional arc. In musical theater, characters sing when and what they can no longer speak. So the songs are really the engine of the narrative arcs. And the architecture of the book musical has stayed relatively consistent since the beginnings in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. You have an opening number that introduces the audience to the world as it is before the inciting incident that will change everything. For example, tradition in Fiddler on the Roof. This is the world as it is. The opening number also usually tells us who to pay attention to. So tradition accomplishes both of those things. Next to Normal, Just Another Day. This is the world as it is before everything changes. Typically, the next song in a musical is known as the I Want song in musical theater scholarship. It's a song that zooms in on the hero of the story and tells us exactly what that character wants but does not yet have. It tells us the overarching desire that becomes the engine driving forward the rest of the show. For example, The Wizard and I in Wicked, or Matchmaker in Fiddler. What do they want but don't have? There we have it. I'll stop here, but just suffice it to say that musical theater shows are built on truly structural templates. Like these, so conditional love songs, charm songs, 11 o'clock numbers, and so on. Musical theaters operate in very, very similar ways to one another. They're very quotational of one another, and there is a set of sort of templates that musical theater writers operate in. Musical theater isn't just a style or something that happens in a specific place, it's actually a genre. And it's this highly specific pop culture, deeply American genre that has now become the dominant mode of passing down and explaining the story of Purim in much of contemporary Jewish American practice. None of this is a given. It's interesting. In the early decades of the 20th century, it's actually quite unlikely because in the early decades of the 20th century, the Purim spiel was in decline in the United States. American rabbinical leaders actually hoped, sometimes quite loudly, that the bawdy, irreverent, satirical Purim plays of the old country might become obsolete in the New World. In 1940, Rabbi Mordechai Waxman published an article entitled The Old-Fashioned Purim Spiel, in which he declared emphatically that the crude and primitive Purim spiel was, quote, a thing of the past in America, end quote. In the end, the resurgence of the Purim spiel in the United States came from a new generation of Jewish religious leaders rebelling against the accepted wisdom of their elders. So where did the musical theater Purim spiel come from? What I think is the answer, it's hard to say because these things are not always so well documented or preserved, but what I think is the answer might surprise you, Orthodox rabbinical students in the 1960s. So the first example of a musical theater parody Purim spiel that I have been able to find took place in 1963 at Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois, where the students produced a parody of West Side Story called North Side Story. And in their version, the Starks faced off against the Stotts. This is, by the way, extremely ironic that this is the first one, or maybe the first one, because of the history of West Side Story, which maybe some people in the room know. West Side Story was originally supposed to be called East Side Story, and it was originally supposed to be written as a story about a Jewish family, a star-crossed romance with a Jewish family at the center, and then the creators got a little nervous about making too Jewish of a story, so they changed it and decided to write about Puerto Ricans who they knew nothing about. So you can go in the archives and you can see some of their early drafts of material for East Side Story, which they were actively writing before they decided maybe it was too Jewish for a popular audience. Anyway, so that's the first example that I'm aware of, and in these parody Purim spiels in this particular setting, in Hebrew Theological College, the content was very deeply connected to kind of the vocabulary and the landscape of what it was to be a student studying in this particular place and time. The show was a hit. The next year, the students staged a new musical parody called Bye Bye Beardy, which was a parody of Bye Bye Birdie that was actually about hippie draft dodgers who enrolled in rabbinical school with no intention of becoming rabbis, so just to avoid the draft. It also may have been the first sort of musical theater mashup. One of the characteristics of these musical theater Purim spielen that I think is very prevalent is that you have a show that's based on one show but draws material from other shows. So here we have a show based on Bye Bye Birdie, but the most memorable song was based on Put on a Happy Face, which is not from Bye Bye Birdie at all, but from another Broadway musical. But that's not really the point, the mashup of these things. If you'll indulge me, I'll share with you just a little bit from Bye Bye Birdie that I found kind of delightful. So here's Put on a Happy Face from Bye Bye Birdie. So you might be conscripted, but put on a happy face. All my chavrusas skipped it, and I might feel out of place. Will I be able to go to Minyan there? Keep kosher as well. Just don't be disappointed when you're there. It's not a hotel, right? So the next year, the students produced How to Succeed in the Yeshiva Without Really Trying, and so on. There's only one photograph that I have of these. This is The Wizard of Oz, which is a couple years later. But this is the students at Hebrew Theological College doing another of these Purim shows. This became a tradition at the college. For the next several decades, musical theater-style Purim spiels, I think, were more the exception in American culture rather than the rule. Synagogue started adopting these at different times. There's a great article in the New York Times from a couple years ago about a man who wrote these for 27 years, and it became like the center point of his life starting in the 80s. So it became a tradition in different places at different times, often at the initiative of individual congregants who were excited by the idea of writing these parodies. I actually wonder if the flip towards this becoming very prevalent in American Jewish culture might have had something to do with the success in 1982 of Forbidden Broadway, which was extremely popular secular parody musical theater revue. Perhaps that sparked some ideas and excitement about parody and musical theater and Purim for a generation of American Jewish congregants. Perhaps not. But today, the connection between musical theater, parody, and Purim spiel is so very well established. It's almost a prerequisite if you want to work as a clergy person in a synagogue. If you have the musical theater knowledge to write these parodies, that's very valuable. If not, there's a whole cottage industry where you can buy or commission musical theater Purim spiels from writers who have made creating these parodies their profession or part of it. So there's the spiel guy, who promises to provide everything you need for a funny, fabulous Purim spiel, including karaoke tracks so your amateur actors can practice. For example, here's one of his spiels, the Mamma Mia Megillah. But this is his Hamilton version. Vashti sings a version of You'll Be Back called I'll Be Back, where she sings, I'll be back as the queen. I've not left the show, I've left the scene. So it's a sort of meta-theatrical ditty that's very musical theater. There's also the Rabbi Cantor songwriting team at PurimSpiels.com. They all do commissions, by the way, and it seems that their main trade is commissions because I think people expect that the Purim spiel that they get is going to be unique to their shul and not something that they can find anywhere else. So there's a lot of pressure to create these unique Purim spielen, but you can also buy ones out of the box. From that, you can order Grease, a schmaltz Purim. I will play you just because it's sort of delightful. Just a quick, let's see, here we go. Here's You're the One That I Want from Grease, a schmaltz Purim.
did I do? What was I signing? Yes, I almost lost control. On the truth, we were relying. Haman was really trying. It's good you shaped up, 'cause we need a king who to justice would be true. Good you shaped up, and you understand that I'm not the only Jew. There's one thing left for me to do. You're the one that I want. Jew, 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 boy, the one that I want.
Okay, and one more from this team. They're like a powerhouse team here. This is Esther's Lament from Guys and Dolls, What's in the Megillah, based on Adelaide's Lament from Guys and Dolls.
It says here in this Tanakh, the God-fearing individual acting as a queen due to a tough situation may react with klechsing in the kishkes, difficult to endure down in the lower gastrointestinal tract. In other words, just for draining the cup to go to the king or not, a maidel can get put on the spot.
Okay, so we'll stop there with those. So these are some of the things you can buy these for your shul if you would like, or commission them to write one just for you. There's also a newer addition to the scene, Mean Persians. They seem to specialize in newer musicals. It's kind of the upstart enterprise. So Mean Persians, which is Mean Girls the musical, but Shushan style. Shticks, based on Six. There's also Dear Esther Heyman, Dear Evan Hansen, and Beat All Jews. The Spiel by Haman, based on Beetlejuice. So these are all like musicals of the past couple of years in Purim Spiel style. Okay, so I'll show you one more excerpt and then talk you through a couple of examples. This is from Beverly Hills. This is a local Purim Spiel. This is from a Schitt's Creek cabaret mashup themed Purim Spiel. And this is their opening number / advertisement for why you should come to attend it.
What good is sitting alone in your room? Come see our Purim play. Life is a Purim spiel, old chum. Come see our Purim spiel. Put down the remote, the book, and the Zoom. It's time for a holiday. Life is a Purim spiel, old chum. Come see the Purim spiel.
Just drink your wine, it won't be bland. Come sound your grog or start celebrating. Right this way, your spiel is waiting. What good permitting some profit?
These all day, but I just have a few more things to share with you. So these are funny, right? These are funny. These are popular humor, satirical. But there's also often in these Purim Spielen a turn to the serious that happens. And I think there's something really interesting about that, which is, there's something, we'll go back for a second. There's something very sort of classically, quintessentially musical theater about that turn, musical theater when it happens. Musical theater has a lot to do with comedy. It comes out of comedic genres. But the innovation of Oklahoma and the shows that followed it was that you take something that is entertaining and has all of this entertaining musical value, and you create a story that makes you feel deep emotions, right? That was sort of the turning point of what Oklahoma did that sort of reshaped what this genre is. And so one part of the musical theater template is that, yes, you have to laugh, but maybe you also want to cry. Right? It's those two things together, which is maybe very Jewish. Those two things are happening together. Musical theater always has comedy, but it also always has to have heart. And so some of what these Porumspielen are doing, some of it is purely let's make people laugh based on these songs that they know from this very particular canon. But some of it is also kind of reflecting on being a Jew in America today. So here are a couple of examples. This is a Sound of Music Porumspiel. This is not the serious part yet. So there's some incredibly goofy songs in this Porumspiel, like the Lonely Goat Herd Apple Kugel parody that really has not a tremendous amount of dramatic purpose. It's really a charm song is what it is in this version, right? I have an urge to make apple kugel, lady or lady or lay hee hoo, right? So very silly. You have the Maria parody about Haman. How do you stop a villain like that Haman, right? So these very sort of silly songs that are just designed to make you laugh. But then, you also have ballads. And as humorous as this is, there's also kind of a turn that it takes, right? Musical theater has these powerhouse emotional songs. So you've got the Sound of Music. In this version, we have the hills are alive with the sound of crying, for Jews have been harmed for 1,000 years, right? There's still that sort of satirical touch, but there's a turn that's sort of happening. In the end of it, I'll cry no more. So there's these sort of powerhouse numbers that come out in these spiels sometimes. I'll give you one more example. So this is from The Shushan Mermaid, so full disclosure, for the past 8 years, I've been co-directing Porumspiels at my synagogue with my amazing friend and colleague Lily Lucy, who's like a brilliant lyricist who does this beautifully. So this is from the inside. But this is so in The Little Mermaid, the I Want song is part of your world, right? That's what Ariel wants. She wants to be part of this world that she can't be a part of. That drives everything forward from the moment that song happens until the very end of the story. So in this Porumspiel version, it actually happens 3 times. Towards the beginning, Mordecai tells Esther what she should want, right? And what she should want is to find a way to let her people be part of the world that they are struggling to be a part of, right? So that's the first iteration of this. Then there's sort of a penultimate point, a turning point in the story where Esther finally recognizes that this is the work that she needs to do, and she gets up there and she sings Part of Your World to the king. So I will stop. You can read this on your own. You can imagine it in your head. But then the last piece of this is that at the very end of the show, the entire cast sings to the audience this almost sort of like meta-theatrical, right? This is addressed directly to the audience. Now we're in the present time. We're not in Shushan anymore. What if you're meant to be where you are? Be who you are, be Jewish and proud. And let me tell you, this was an audience that was full of tears at the end of this show. So as silly as this show was, you saw the silly pictures at the beginning. This is also something that created an emotional journey for an audience, which is, again, sort of classic musical theater. So, last thing. Typically, when we're talking about parody, the goal is to showcase an incongruity between form and content. That's usually how parody works. But in these contemporary Porumspiels, the goal is somewhat of the inverse. Porumspiel authors try to demonstrate that Jewish storytelling fits naturally into popular Broadway musicals, as though it was always there. In shows like Oklahoma or My Fair Maidel, Porumspielen have become vehicles of reverse acculturation, emphasizing the Jewish origins of a Broadway and thus American culture that for many decades took great pains to mask it. So musical theater Porumspielen represent a synthesis of Jewish and American theatrical cultures, symbolizing and performing a sort of belonging. Porumspiels are about retelling the story of Esther in an engaging fashion, but they're also retelling another story about American Jewish belonging in all of its complexity. I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for such an exciting presentation. I'm probably not the only one in this group who felt very spoken to and seen, since I'm part of the troupe at my minyan. I was Achashverosh this year. I'll share you a lot. I have a lot of posters from past spiel and everything. I'm so excited to give you our stuff. But I was really struck by, a lot of things you said, but I'll keep it brief. That the origins are in an Orthodox setting, in this Chicago yeshiva, and then, but you said kind of in passing that, and I know there are exceptions to this, but that they're less common in Orthodox shuls than in other than conservative reform, et cetera, in the U.S. And so I'm kind of wondering, I am aware of some exceptions, but I'm kind of wondering about kind of what happened there. And so if you could just speak about that a little bit, I'd be really interested.
I think the short answer to the question is maybe that in this origin moment in the among the students, this was students who were doing their own thing. This wasn't under the direction of people saying this is the established. This was just sort of a thing they were doing as a sort of side project that was all on their sort of youthful rebellious initiative in the 1960s. So I think that there's something different about something like this happening in a synagogue. I think it sends a sort of different message that, and enshrined as part of the practice of observance. I think that that's where maybe the differentiation, where some Orthodox communities are maybe not as comfortable with putting popular American culture at the center of a service comes from. But with the students in seminary, it's a different kind of a situation. But yeah, it is interesting.
Thanks, that was such a joy to hear. Enjoying watching my kids in these cheesy spiels every year. But for years, when I was in Youngstown, Ohio, I played at a synagogue where we used to read the Megillah, and then we just pass out the handout with all the parodies from the past and things like, I even wrote a few of them. We would just sing them without the actual spiel, which suggests to me also, and this is getting to my question, is that I've played in concerts of Hanukkah music, concerts of Passover music with orchestras and choirs and everything, but there's really not a good core of Purim songs. It just doesn't exist. Is that because the spiel in this ever-changing tradition, there's never been someone to just write Purim music, and I know parodies are music just like anything else, but it seems like there's no obligatory Purim songs. I know there once was a Wicked Man. There's nothing great.
That's really interesting. I mean, there's definitely a couple, and there's like lesser known Yiddish Purim songs that have not been taken up by sort of, predominant cultural practices now. But I think that the centerpiece of Purim, maybe not always, but for at least hundreds or 1,000 years, was always theater. So and the traditional Purim spielen were not always musical. They were not always about songs. So I think that the idea of music as a centerpiece of Purim is maybe a newer component coming from this musical theater place. But it's always been kind of a theater engine.
Okay, last question.
I have two really quick comments. I enjoyed every second of this presentation. Thank you so much. Okay, first of all, I think a cappella choirs might be another interesting arena to look into. My husband's a cappella choir in Toronto would do annual concerts. I'll show you the posters. They're great. And the other thing is that I think the precursor to this whole story of the Purim Spiel musical theater program might actually be Purim Spiel operettas. So one of the things that I'm hoping to write about for my next book is Jewish involvement with the Mikado, and taking that all the way from the early 20th century all the way through to the present day and doing all kinds of bizarre things to it, including Purim Spiels, which happen about 10 years before these begin. So something we might be able to dialogue about. Thank you.
I love that. Let's continue the conversation. That's super interesting.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you one more time to Debra.
Thank you.